Hello and welcome to the almost impossible task of picking the top 10 quotations on Romeo. Now, I've done this by choosing the quotations which will get you maximum marks in a question if you're doing this in an exam. Let's jump in to quotation number 1. Shakespeare wants us to know that Romeo is immoral and obsessed by sex. So he's after Rosaline, and he's picked Rosaline because she's a Capulet and therefore potentially unattainable and also in opposition to his parents because obviously they're in a feud with the Capulet family. But we also find that he's trying to bribe her into having sex. This portrays him as an immature young man. But it also points out a problem with this society because it is patriarchal, in which women are treated not just as inferior but also as the property of men. Their virginity is something that gives them high resale value. So in economic terms, fathers actually sell their daughters to husbands. The husbands pay them a high price in terms of being from a rich, wealthy family, a connected family, who are nobles like the Capulets and Montagues. And in return, the father pays a fee, a dowry, but also the daughter's virginity. So in order to have sex, Romeo has to overcome this problem of the daughter's virginity, and therefore is trying to bribe Rosaline with gold. Enough gold to get a saint to agree to have sex with him. But Rosaline is too smart for Romeo and says no. This dramatises Romeo as a dislikable character in some ways. But even more, Shakespeare uses it to show how society is the problem. If it weren't so patriarchal, people would have sex consensually, as now, and perhaps the tragedy would never have happened. Because the only way Romeo can have sex with Juliet is to marry her. And without the marriage, there's no tragedy. Shakespeare's next attack on Romeo before he meets Juliet is this dream that he's had before he goes to the Capulet ball. Now, it doesn't take a dream for him to realise that this is a very bad idea indeed. The prince has just broken up a further feud and has said that if there's any further bloodshed, he will execute the person starting the brawl. Well, what are the odds on one of the Montague clan causing a brawl by gate-crashing the Capulet ball? Pretty high. But that's not all. Romeo has had a direct message from fate, because that's what you need in a tragedy. The character has to know about their potential fate. What does Romeo do? He totally ignores that warning. He says, "My mind misgives. There is a consequence hanging in the stars, like this is going to be bad." How bad? It's going to result in death. It's going to be fearfully bitter. And it's going to start with this ball if I go to it. But what the hell? Let's do it anyway. I'm a teenager. What do I care? And there is a bonus grade 9 feature to this as well. In Greek tragedy, the hero finds out about their fate, and does absolutely everything in their power to avoid it. But in a Shakespearean tragedy, the hero finds out about their fate and rushes towards it. So here we have the myth of Icarus and Daedalus, his father, and they're escaping from a tower wearing wings made out of wax. Daedalus warns Icarus not to fly too close to the sun because the sun will melt his waxen wings and he'll fall to his death. But Icarus is so excited and full of hubris, being younger and male, flies too close to the sun and is killed. Here's another example with Oedipus. He hears that his fate is going to be to kill his father, so he leaves his country and goes to the neighbouring country ruled by King Laius, who is actually his real father, of course. Oedipus doesn't know this. He meets him on the road, riding a chariot with some guards. The king is incredibly rude to Oedipus. There's a fight, and Oedipus, being the great warrior that he is, kills King Laius and then goes off in fact to become king himself, marrying his own mother. Things turn very bad indeed. But Oedipus has tried to avoid his fate. And this arrogance is the character's fatal flaw, which the Greeks called their hamartia. And so the idea was that the character in a tragedy had to be noble and suffer from a hamartia. In this case, hubris. Next, we have this fantastic series of contrasts that Romeo uses between black and white. And he wants to contrast the whiteness and purity and beauty of Juliet to Rosaline, who now becomes forgotten. So let's read you what my guide has to say about this. Although Romeo celebrates Juliet's beauty, the imagery is also full of warnings of fate. Her beauty makes the torches burn brighter because she is so bright. But comparing her to a torch's light also invites us to associate her with a flame, which will of course burn too brightly and then die. So it foreshadows her early death. Juliet is exotic, like a rich Ethiopian in Juliet is also exotic, like a rich Ethiopian in Elizabethan London. But the Ethiopian is also racially different and therefore a symbol of conflict, of not fitting in. And this is a clue that Romeo and Juliet's marriage is not going to fit into their society. Shakespeare loved this kind of imagery and in fact turns to it to create a whole play, Othello, where he introduces a black lead character who's married to a white woman and then, through the exploitation of racism in society, is duped into believing that Desdemona, his wife, has been unfaithful to him, and he actually ends up killing her. Sorry about that if you didn't know. But when Shakespeare chooses this image of Juliet as the pearl on the black skin of an Ethiopian, he's not just doing that to contrast white and black. He has these racial differences and the prejudice around them uppermost in his mind. It's amazingly cool, isn't it? Shakespeare, over 400 years ago, campaigning against racial prejudice. I find that inspirational anyway. Now, the idea that her beauty is too dear for earth implies that she's obviously going to find a home in heaven, therefore foreshadowing Juliet's death. The dove is also chosen because it rhymes with love and symbolises the purity of love. But snowy doesn't just imply whiteness. It's also cold and wintry and implies death. So too does the symbolism of being surrounded by crows. Romeo means it to show how ugly all the other dancing women are compared to Juliet. But the symbolism of the crows depends on their blackness. Here it's not a racial difference, it's a symbol of death and decay. So all the language that Romeo uses to describe Juliet also serves as a warning to his own unconscious mind that she is going to die as a result of Romeo's decision to meet her. So here Shakespeare introduces the idea that the tragedy is Romeo's fault. Next, we have the language of the sonnet that Romeo and Juliet construct as they meet and fall in love. Now, obviously, the sonnet form is appropriate to a love story, and Shakespeare does that to show that their love might be real rather than just teenage lust. But the language of their sonnet would have shocked a Shakespearean audience because it takes religious Christian imagery and uses it not to describe God and the spiritual, but to describe sexual passion. So here he compares his lips to blushing pilgrims. Pilgrims go on a journey to a holy place, to a shrine, a holy shrine. This is the shrine in Jerusalem, and legend has it, Christian belief at the time would have it, that it was built on the site on which Jesus was crucified. I'll tell you a fascinating story about this church at the end if you're interested. But he's using this religious imagery to link the idea of his blushing pilgrim lips to the idea of kissing Juliet. So entirely sexual. Now you remember that hubris was arrogance that challenged the gods, and that's exactly why Shakespeare has chosen this Christian language to show that the lovers, because they both share this symbolism in their sonnet, are challenging God in a blasphemous way. Now, I love this line because it points to Romeo's culpability in causing the tragedy, but it also shows how Shakespeare wants to show patriarchal society and its rules are mainly at fault. So here we have an image of the Globe Theatre. Juliet is at her balcony, and the whole deal here is that Romeo can't get up there. Now, you probably remember the Baz Luhrmann film, where this scene is set in a swimming pool. They're obviously very intimate here, and when Romeo says, "Oh, wilt thou leave me so unsatisfied?" it's clearly a demand that he wants to have sex with her. Juliet replies, "What satisfaction canst thou have tonight?" In other words, do you think I'm easy? Am I going to put out on the first date? No way. And then Romeo says, "Well, I just want your proof of love." And then Juliet says, "Let's get married." You remember that. In the Baz Luhrmann film, it kind of suggests that Romeo is just being a bit of a mug here. He's willing to marry Juliet just so that he can have sex with her and forget about the consequences. But staging it this way is a little bit more interesting. Shakespeare is pointing out that the only way for Romeo to have sex is to marry Juliet. So in this version of the play, we might imagine that Romeo could keep coming back, every week, and after a few months, Juliet might give in. So his decision to marry Juliet seems kind of dumb. Whereas in this version, we realise that there are impenetrable barriers. He'll never be able to climb up there, and Juliet and Romeo are never going to be able to have sex unless they marry, because of the patriarchal society. And the barriers put up by the patriarchal society are really symbolised by the staging. Shakespeare uses this staging to attack the patriarchal society for forcing them to marry and causing the tragedy. We never even heard of our next quotation. But Juliet calls Romeo back and she wants a falconer's voice. Romeo answers by calling Juliet my NYAS, which was a baby falcon that needed to be trained. Now, this quotation again shows that the lovers are unsuited. Juliet sees herself as the falconer, so she would have the glove that the falcon perched on. She describes Romeo as a peregrine falcon, which was associated with royalty. It was the prince, if you like, of falcons. But crucially, she believes she is in control of him. And she is. It's her suggestion that they get married, and Romeo sets it up the next day. So although Romeo has started the tragedy, Juliet now controls him. Or at least, Juliet believes she controls him. But when we get this quotation, my NYAS, Romeo doesn't just see himself as the falconer, he believes that he can totally train this baby falcon. And this points to another problem with the patriarchal society as it's presented in the play. Juliet is 13. She's too young. Romeo fixates on her youth because he wants to train her. This was the male perspective in the play. Now, it's really important for you to know that marrying off daughters at 13 was not a common thing in Elizabethan England. The average age of marriage was still about 24. So why does Shakespeare put it in the play to criticise the patriarchal society? Well, because of all the other patriarchal things being true. You still had to marry as a virgin, the father still had to pay a dowry, and so they would therefore look for someone who was powerful and influential and very likely much older than the daughter. Think about it, Romeo isn't going to become powerful until his father's dead, and then Romeo becomes Lord Montague himself. So Shakespeare exaggerates the age of marriage here to show how damaging this control of women is. Now, for an extra grade 9 point, he's also attacking Catholics because Verona is Italian, it's a Catholic state. Elizabethans are all Protestant. They fear and hate the Catholics. And so Shakespeare is criticising Catholics because his audience will enjoy that. So he's also presenting a society which appears morally wrong to an Elizabethan audience. But this contrast of both lovers seeing themselves as the falconer and the person that they love as the falcon reveals that there is conflict in this relationship. And then finally, with this image, the falcon is bred to kill. And of course, killing and death is what this marriage is about. And by giving this symbolic language to the lovers, Shakespeare is showing how they cause each other's death. They each hunt the other. Now we come to the challenge that Tybalt gives Romeo because he wants to kill him for attending the ball. You might remember the conversation that Tybalt had with Mercutio, where he says, "Thou consortest with Romeo." Mercutio makes a big deal about this, because by using this language, Tybalt is suggesting that Mercutio and Romeo are lovers. More about that in my guide if you're interested. But because that conversation has happened just before Romeo says these words, when he talks about having love for Tybalt, this feels as though Romeo is telling Tybalt that he is sexually attracted to him. It sounds like a way of mocking him. Now, interestingly, there was no such word as homosexual. There wasn't a concept of homosexuality in Shakespeare's time. It wouldn't be unusual for young men to explore a sexual passion with each other. Men were simply expected to put this aside once they got married. But in Tybalt's hyper-masculine world that's obsessed with masculine honour, it's treated as an insult. So how much is Romeo to blame for this? Well, let's go to my guide again. Romeo could simply have replied with the words beginning at villain. Villain am I none, he could have said. He didn't have to put in that bit about loving Tybalt. This would be a factual reply, and it would be impossible to misunderstand. A villain did not have the modern meaning of a criminal. It was an insult about class and status. A villain was a person of low birth status, with no manners or refinement. In our society, or at least 10 years ago, we would have called them a chav. But this insult had much more power in Elizabethan society because it was such a class-based society, and because gentlemen in particular were expected to display ritualised good manners. It was part of these good manners that led Romeo to say he loved Tybalt. But he goes on to repeat this love twice more. To Tybalt, the only logical explanation is that Romeo is mocking his sexuality. This arguably causes the rage, which encourages him to fight Mercutio, and then to stab Mercutio dishonourably while Mercutio was not prepared. So now Shakespeare is implying that homophobia is also part of the cause of the tragedy. So not only has Romeo given us an insight into Shakespeare's attitude towards racism, now we've got homophobia being criticised as a cause for the tragedy. What a modern play. However, in quotation number 8, we can also see that Romeo is to blame. But once again, Shakespeare is blaming the patriarchal society that keeps prioritising men over women. Look at what he says before he kills Tybalt. "Sweet Juliet, thy beauty hath made me effeminate." So he's accusing Juliet of having stopped him being a real man. A real man, he says to himself, would kill Tybalt for killing Mercutio. Now this, of course, is stupid. Everybody knows Tybalt's going to be killed by the prince because he's killed Mercutio. Mercutio is even related to the prince. It's the prince's nephew. So there's no way Tybalt is getting away with this. But no, Romeo wants to prove he's a man, and he believes that as a man, he's got to kill Tybalt. This is Shakespeare's way of criticising male society and this idea of how men relate to each other. Dueling had become quite common by Shakespeare's time. There were ritualised rules about it, and Tybalt has broken those rules by killing Mercutio when he's undefended. These rules were supposed to reduce death, because obviously you wouldn't insult someone if the consequence was that you were likely to have to end up fighting them to the death. It would force you to be very polite to every young man you met. Well, that might have been the intention, but Shakespeare is arguing the opposite. He's saying, look, if you take all these teenage male brains and then you arm all of them with knives and swords, society is just going to become much more violent. And so he uses Romeo to attack this very idea of masculinity. Now, I've chosen quotation number 9 because it brings us back to Shakespeare's intention here of exploring fate and tragedy. So once Romeo has killed Tybalt, does he blame himself? Oh no. He says, oh, I am Fortune's fool. It's nothing to do with me. It was the fates. They made me do it. The fates were 3 characters in Greek mythology who decided how long a person should live and how they would die. And so he's claiming that the fates have acted on him. But Shakespeare has been really clear to make sure we understand it's all been Romeo all along. This speech that we just had from Romeo was a soliloquy, spoken not to any other character but to the audience, and Shakespeare's convention always is that the soliloquy is true. It's the character's own thoughts and beliefs. So we know with 100% certainty that it's Romeo's fault, and when he says this, he's in denial. Shakespeare is clearly blaming Romeo for how the tragedy unfolds. Another top grade point for you here is that Fortune's fool both begin with F's. These are fricatives, and the fricative is used to symbolise aggression because the teeth come onto the lips in order to say it. That's why our most famous swear word begins with F. It is an evolutionary thing. You look at any animal, when they're aggressive, they bare their teeth. So when we have fricative sounds, writers use them to symbolise aggression. This is another way that Shakespeare is suggesting Romeo's aggression, his masculine aggression, is at fault. Now for our 10th quotation, it was really difficult because we got all this wonderful poetry when Romeo sees Juliet and believes that she's dead. But I can only have 10 quotations, so I've picked one that's going to get you grade 9. You might not remember that Paris and Romeo fight in front of Juliet's tomb. Romeo doesn't want to fight Paris, but Paris forces him to. Romeo kills Paris, and in Paris's dying breath, he asks Romeo to bury him next to Juliet, to take him into the tomb next to her. Romeo agrees. Now that sort of destroys the love story a bit, doesn't it? But Shakespeare does that because he's writing a tragedy. Romeo sees himself as a tragic hero, rather than as an immature fool who has caused the tragedy itself. Shakespeare wants to play with this. He wants us to question whether Romeo is entirely at fault or how much society is at fault. So here he takes the dead Paris's hand because he says that Paris's name has been written in Misfortune's book, the Book of Fate. And so as a tragic hero, he's going to give him a triumphant grave in the monument, the Capulet monument. Now, when Romeo presents it like that, he's saying that the cause of the tragedy is actually love. Paris was in love with Juliet. Romeo was in love with Juliet. That is their tragedy and why they're both going to die at Juliet's side. But Shakespeare plays with this idea and undermines it all the way through the whole play. Why did Romeo and Juliet get married? Well, I've already hinted here that it was much more about sexual passion than love. And if you check out my guide, you'll see how Paris isn't in love with Juliet. For him, it's all about sexual passion as well. So really what Shakespeare is attacking here is the patriarchal rules controlling sexual relationships. On that topic, here's some bonus grade 9 content for you. Shakespeare married Anne Hathaway when she was 26 and he was 18, and she was already 3 months pregnant. So we know Shakespeare was against this patriarchal ruling in society that controlled people's sexuality. And therefore, he's suggesting that it's society that's also to blame through its patriarchal rules. Now, I promised you a bit of fascinating information about this church in Jerusalem. Because it's the origins of Christianity, every branch of Christianity owns a piece of it. Well, at least 4 of them do. And these 4 different Christian branches were always in dispute with each other. And so the person with the key to the church had to be Jewish, because the Jewish person was the only one who would be fair. I just love that story. And if you'd like to get much better at Romeo and Juliet without buying my guide, click on one of the videos appearing somewhere up there or there. See you soon on my channel.